Thank you very much. And I think that is a wonderful note to end our presentations on, that if we have the source of redemption for Australian life in our suburbs, if it's not modern monotony, if we have that chance to question, to reimagine, then I think that's an important note that Andrew has given us to start our discussion. And what I would like to do, I think, is open up for questions in a moment, and I will remind you that this session is being recorded, so when we do go to questions, if you wouldn't mind speaking clearly, and we do have roving mics to assist that process. But I guess I'd like to just do a quick go through the three speakers and say one thing that you think needs to be changed, reimagined in relation to climate change if we are to redeem the suburb. So we'll start maybe with Andrew first.
I think, gee, that's a fantastic. And one thing, I think one of the keys is to address the kind of fictions we tell ourselves. We're very informed. We've had a lot of experience. We have a lot of advice, but we have a lot of fiction, sort of fictional narratives to explain to ourselves the way that suburban life and city life operates. One statistic I learned recently was, for example, there were more road accident deaths in Australia, almost twice as many over the course of the 20th century than all the Australians killed in all the wars in the 20th century, which is an extraordinary way of kind of turning around some of these assumptions we have about the prices we're prepared to pay for the sort of lifestyle that we enjoy. So if there's one thing, it's about actually convincing ourselves that some of these prices that we're prepared to pay are real or not. And then that, I think, can galvanise us into actually more radical and immediate responses.
Good, thank you. Perhaps someone in the audience might like to take that up too in terms of reassessing fictions. And Philip?
It's a difficult question, just one. I'm going to have two.
Yeah, all right, okay.
I think one thing, in terms of climate change in the suburbs, it would be great if we could rethink suburbia. And after all, the word is suburb, so it's sort of under city. But if you were to think about it as having what Andrew was talking about, this idea of urbanity, that walking, if you could walk to your shop, your school, your local library, how would we redesign the outer fringes with that in mind just now? And that doesn't mean you need to change the housing type also necessarily, but just walking. And the second would be one of the key aspects of climate change and the suburb is the intrinsic nature of house and garden, and to never lose that. I mean, it's one of suburbia's great strengths. So how do you actually keep house and landscape, and is it a 1 + 1 = 500 in terms of this idea of house and landscape? It's what makes suburbia. And the two can work together, house and landscape, to provide fantastic solutions in terms of climate change.
Good, thank you very much. And Peter, please.
Well, if he can have two, I'm going to have two. Firstly, I'd emphasise that issue that I was trying to bring up about the suburb being productive. I think without an enormous effort, but using considerable funds and incentives, we can make the suburbs very productive in terms of energy, in terms of renewable energy, and much more self-sufficient in terms of both water and food. So I think that's a framework to operate to. But the other thing I think we need to do is to make that achievable and palatable. We do need to engage in a very substantial form of public education to make it a recognisable issue. At this point in time, I think there's a broad recognition that this is a concern, but it's a distant one, it's a vague one, and without that sort of deeply embedded local community-based support, no amount of regulation, no amount of assistance is actually going to achieve that outcome.
Good, thank you. Okay, well, with those three sort of, well, 5, I think, points, could we open up to questions, please? And yes, okay, so I think way up the back was first, 1, 2, 3, and if we could have the mic there, thank you.
Suburban life revolves very much around automobiles. And automobiles are a major source of greenhouse gas emissions around the world. There are now close to 1 billion cars in the world. China and India are now becoming very enamored of the automobile. And in redeeming the suburb, how are we going to address this problem of not necessarily doing away with the suburb, but perhaps reducing the use of motor vehicles and relying more and more on mass transportation as well as bicycling, walking. So I was wondering if the panelists could address that, because I think it's a very important factor in looking at climate change.
Good. So we need to think about redeeming the car or transport as well. So perhaps could we open it up? Who'd like to comment, please? I think perhaps Philip first up.
I think your question is an extremely pertinent one, which relates back to my response about walking. It means that we're never going to do away with the motor car completely, but what we should try and do is, as you're implying, try and reduce our reliance upon it. And whether that means, and it does mean, an increased attention to public transport infrastructure in terms of trains, trams, buses, but also the encouragement of people to use bicycles. But it's a whole community attitude, I think, that has to also be changed in terms of how really necessary is the use of the motor car for everyday activities, like shopping. Do you really need to do it in terms of using the motor car to do those simple activities? And it has to do with proximity and redesigning those essential ideas to do with proximity. So from house to shopping centre, from house to major transport interchange where you can go to work. Do we actually encourage more people to actually work from home? There's a myriad of possibilities to actually try and reduce the use of the motor car. Not one magic solution, I'm afraid.
Mm-hmm. Peter, did you want to have a quick comment? Or?
Just a quick additional comment, I suppose. I absolutely agree with what Philip's saying. It's a very complex issue, partly to do with reconfiguring social relations and work relations in particular. But one thing's very clear, that we simply can't expect people to move from the car to an alternative that doesn't exist. And at this point in time, we need a very substantial transitional program to provide those alternatives. So if, for example, we are to rely on public transport, then we have to have that alternative there before jacking up petrol prices or before raising other forms of regulatory impost, which will generally not go down very well politically at all. So the emphasis really has to be in a staged and very carefully planned transformation, of which investing in public transport clearly would be one component.
I think that notion of there's a combination of things. There are disincentives by way of fuel taxes or otherwise. There are incentives to do with hybrid vehicles, to do with carpooling and so on. But I think that kind of localising sphere of it is very important. And we haven't really embraced even the kind of design, some of the design, local issues. I mean, I know overseas there are many kind of concepts of sort of shared street spaces, the kind of Woonurf, the Dutch model, shared spaces in the UK, where bicycles and pedestrians have legal priority over cars in some local streets. And with Philip's idea of the school as the kind of hub of the neighbourhood, we've really got a long way to go from putting a few speed humps in to actually making the pace of public life at that local level mean that people are actually interacting more, and that's another key to it. When you slow down, you actually have eye contact with people, and when you have eye contact with people, you actually have to negotiate more. All these other complex issues about how we relate to neighbours, to strangers, and so on. So there's a whole new kind of ecosystem that we really haven't trialled in public space like that. Yeah.
Good, thank you. That issue of public space is a really important one, isn't it, that has been picked up in a number of the presentations. I think we had a question over this side next, please.
Discussion to date has not addressed the question of the change in housing needed as people change in their ages. If you look around any of the older suburbs, you find that by and large they are underutilized. And in many cases, people, where they talk of retirement villages as people get older, they're out in whoop whoop. Now, having arrived in that age, I don't want to live in whoop whoop. And I don't see where there is any government policy which addresses this question and particularly ties it into the kind of facilities, and including university facilities. Could you comment?
Good, thank you. So an idea of a life cycle putting in with cultural change. And so who on the panel would like to take that one first, please?
Well, I can just make a very quick comment. I mean, clearly there is some trend towards a greater investment in community and support. But I think that trend needs to be greatly enhanced, both in terms of assistance and the idea that people who become, as they become more elderly, should be supported to remain at home and within the communities that they're familiar with. That's a significant trend that's beginning to emerge in welfare thinking. But there's a range of other forms of support that also need to be required. I think that we're at a very early stage, and as the baby boomers now sort of move towards that particular moment in their lives, I think that trend in policy is going to be strengthened considerably.
Thank you. Philip, please.
Yeah, I think your question is right on the money, because it comes back to the idea of designing for long life, and many of our houses are not designed for long life or changing life. And it means that your everyday speculative house plan often has no provision for the complexities of a long-term family growth, change and moving on. And it's one of those things too where if one thinks about suburbs as potentially urban villages, that you would want to, if you had been there in the same suburb for 20 years, there's no reason why you shouldn't stay there for the next 50 years. But in terms of the possibilities of other housing types in the same location, there's just no choice. And this is part of the problem, is that the housing types available, they're often not there for the older members of the community. And this is where I think, if one heard Rob Adams this morning talking about potentially densifying public transport arteries, if that was to happen, and by that I mean he was suggesting that one might build medium-density housing along tram lines. Therefore, if you're older and less mobile, those are the sort of apartments to move into. And so the whole suburban network has a long life sort of expectancy. But your question is absolutely right, I think. And the space of the suburbs allows, I think, people to think of the granny flat perhaps is a reality. I mean, as an example, I've just built a separate building in our back garden, and it's for my eldest son, but it could be for my parents or my wife's parents. I mean, these are the sort of possibilities that we need to be thinking about, and that legislation might allow that sort of thing to happen.
In the interest of getting as many questions through as possible, I might move. I think there was a question up the back. Thank you. That was the third one. Yes, thank you.
Andrew, you mentioned things about like a sort of a culture of the suburbs, real or imagined and so on. What I was interested in is, do any of you, the panel, think that there's any contradiction between the heritage controls, which are part of sustaining a culture, and a sustainable or a reimagined city? And in particular, I'm thinking of things like the planning scheme, the Planning Act and the heritage controls, whether they might mitigate against a reimagining of the city in terms of sustainability, keeping in mind that culture is something you might want to sustain. Does any of the panel have any thoughts on that?
Andrew?
Well, I think, heritage is in some ways, although it's a very prescribed concept, it's also a very kind of discretionary and movable concept over time. And I think those negotiations always take place very sort of intimately in a practical way when heritage issues are being sort of debated. And I suppose maybe that's one of those silos that Peter was talking about as well, that might mitigate against some of these new ways of thinking, absolutely, and perhaps that's something that that does need to be short-circuited in a sense. But there are kind of key values that we have, and heritage is one of them, that make cities meaningful cultural, social places. But yes, at the extreme, absolutely, there could be ways that that very strict interpretations or otherwise of heritage can actually keep a bit of a rein on some other ideas that might more productively take us forward. It's always a tension.
Anyone else want to comment just quickly, and then we've got some questions down the front.
Yeah, no, look, I think it's you're absolutely right. Again, heritage is a fantastic gauge of community values, and at the same time, a fantastic way, I think, of thinking about. And it refers back to Andrew's answer to the previous question about an idea of a slower urbanism. We talk about slow cooking, but perhaps we should be talking about slow urbanism. And I think heritage was one of those ideas where the community actually comes together and makes a community decision about what is worthwhile in the built environment. And those, listening to those messages, I think, are extremely important for the way cities can plan growth more carefully. But certainly it's a mitigator.
Perhaps we need a slow urbanism cookbook or something we could put together as part of the Festival of Ideas. I'm not sure who was first here, but I think perhaps at the back of these two here.
How the rest of non-Melbourne, Victoria fits into the picture with regards to the towns and rural cities are actually urban environments as well, and also in the context of public transport in those types of communities, and how you could encourage that type of activity, because it's very hard for people in the country to even get a grip on how to do something like public transport, the lack of discussion.
Thank you very much for that. I think I might throw that.
He wasn't using the mic.
Oh, okay, sorry.
All right, just talking about
non-Melbourne environments and looking at towns and cities as urban entities in themselves, and how they would fit into a Victorian model, and that they could actually offer a different type of alternative with, with respect to public transport as well.
Mm-hmm. So picking up that sea change, tree change phenomenon and looking at the role of regional cities. I think I might throw that out to Peter first, given those were some of the issues he canvassed.
Thanks. So. Look, I think it's a very difficult question to answer in some senses, because of the range of towns that you might want to consider in terms of the rural. If you're thinking about large urban centres like Ballarat and Bendigo, for example, then clearly there are significant issues there, which are similar issues to the ones that you would apply to Melbourne or the Greater Melbourne, in terms of how things should be developed or redeveloped and the sort of constraints and opportunities that should be provided. When you go beyond that to much smaller rural towns and settlements, I think that the pressures that they place on the environment are much less. And so I think that the constraints on them probably ought to be somewhat less as well. And the difficulties of servicing them effectively are much greater. So I'm not quite sure how one answers your question. Certainly there's been a tendency towards planning for nodal development and for trying to integrate population growth. And I have real problems with the issue of population growth. But in any case, while we are trying to settle larger communities of populations within Australia and within cities like Melbourne, the development of nodal communities which are very tightly integrated and very well serviced using public transport, but also all the other facilities that one would expect to have in place in terms of energy use, water and so on and so forth, is very important. So you need to focus significant resources on that sort of development. Beyond that, I'm not sure what the answer would really be, and I think that there are some real issues of both equity and opportunity when you get beyond those major settlements.
Yes, look, I think, because we've got a few more hands coming up, so I think the next person was sitting here in the front, and if you could use the mic, please.
My question relates to, I think what you were just about to touch on there, which was population growth and the importance of how that will figure into planning, because, I've actually been to the last 3 lectures and it hasn't actually been raised yet we've got the federal government giving out a baby bonus in a country where we're struggling to supply our water needs and meeting a lot of other infrastructure problems are yet to truly be solved. How do those sort of issues, do you think, play into what your visions are, and do you see there being a need to draw a line in the sand for those type of issues and focus on that?
Okay, so on that question of the roll-in of population to these issues of the suburb. Would anyone like to take that?
Let's see if we've got an answer to it, have we?
Philip, I think you're in the middle.
I'll try and answer it. It's a very troubled issue, population growth, particularly in Australia, I think. I recall Philip Drew's book, The Coast Dwellers, where he was encouraging to stop population growth and for Australians to actually just sort of huddle at the edges of the continent. And in some respects, if one is gloomy, that's perhaps what we ought to do. And certainly if you're living in Adelaide, you might be a little worried as the city is starting to shrink. But other country centres in Victoria are growing.
Yeah, well, when I say population growth, I mean, you could cap Melbourne at a certain figure and then say let's grow the others now.
Picking up population distribution.
Distribution, absolutely. Now I get your picture, and now I'm happy to answer. But I think, let's say from Melbourne example, yes, we should draw a line around and stop thinking about spread. And certainly we should be, on a broader planning level, taking up what Peter was talking about at the very beginning of today's session, is to think about other centres where if there is pressure on growth, where might be other attention be put. And is it Albury, Wodonga, is it Bairnsdale, is it places which are, and it has to do with water as well and available resources. So I think there needs to be a much broader strategy about population distribution than we've ever thought about before. I mean, I think it's a huge issue.
Although I must admit, remembering back to DIRD, I think that had done some resonances there with that early policy there with DIRD. If I can just exercise some discretion in respect of our festival organiser, Patrick McCackey, I think, who had a question?
Now, without causing offence to our distinguished panel, I'd like to ask both Philip Goad and Peter Christoph first. I loved all that you said, but the only sign we saw of any change was that great blue whale about to swallow the little bank at Camberwell Junction, in terms of all the change that you want to bring about. I saw lovely drawings of gardens growing in suburban streets, but I haven't seen any of those streets. And I remain sceptical of Andrew's version that the suburbs aren't all that bad. I am your geographical snob, which regards that a night out in Glen Waverley is not as good as a night out in the centre of Melbourne. Now, what I really want to know is that one of the curious things at present is that Monash University is now virtually in the dead centre of the population of Melbourne. Now, there could be a great cultural centre. It's not. Monash remains a kind of geographical impassability. Nobody goes to things at Monash. You could never hold a festival of ideas there. Now, it may be...
You would say that, wouldn't you?
I know. It may be because of the stupefying ugliness of Monash University. But I want to know... I see no signs of the evidence of what you're talking about except for Camberwell Junction. And I really think, Andrew, you're going to go a long way to tell me. I mean, have you ever been stranded on the Springvale Road? It is a new desert. I mean, there is nothing there. And when we talk about giving urbanity, I think we've got to move much more dramatically than we have. And I see no evidence of what you're aspiring to do.
Thank you. And I think we have a devil's advocate here. Perhaps a very, very quick response, because I would like to have some further time. And I think we're almost at the end of the session.
My quick response would be, unfortunately, there are people at Monash saying exactly the same thing that you're saying right now as we speak about us. The city is multinodal, and I guess that's again feeding into this notion of what we're trying to imagine, I think, is stripping that down even more into sort of the urban village concept. But Melbourne is a whole series of different cities within the city. The other thing about the good night ad and where you go, well, I guess that's what I was pointing to some of the work of historians who are looking at associational life. We don't just We don't just physically have to go somewhere. We engage in public life. We develop this sort of social capital in lots of different ways, in virtual ways, in associational ways that transcend spatial boundaries. And that, again, has a long history.
Good, thank you. And I think there's Peter wants to have a sort of a 20-second, and then
I'm very grateful for that intervention. Look, I think you're absolutely right. The point I was trying to make was that whatever we think about where we're going with the suburbs, they ain't going to stay the way they are at the moment. And in fact, climate change is an overarching narrative. Makes it very, very clear there are going to have to be substantial reorganisations. I absolutely agree with you that those very pretty pictures, and I was trying to make the point about them, and perhaps also about Philip's vision for Camberwell. Those opportunities and those visions for the future will only occur if we have very substantial institutional change based on a clear-sighted understanding that unless we reduce emissions, reduce our water use and plan very differently in a very short period of time, we will have a much worse alternative. So those are utopian visions unless we have the institutional change, in particular the regulatory and the funding capacities to drive that change. And I think that change won't come from within the states. I think the states are too politically compromised for a range of reasons to actually achieve them.
Join me in thanking our speakers and for your participation. So thank you very much.